Acts chapter 20. You guys want to turn to Acts 20 with me? And as Pastor Rowdy said, at the end of the message, we always do a takeaway. What's something you heard today that you want to apply to your life this week? If you need a Bible, they're on the chairs in front of you. And actually, if you borrow a Bible, I'd get you there quickly. It's page 929. We'd encourage you, bring a Bible, bring a notebook. We use them every week. All right. The last few Sundays, we've covered a few times different parts of evangelism and discipleship, right? We've talked about how the gospel goes out through the church and how we disciple people into Christ so that the gospel can go out through the church. And today I just want to kind of look at, like, to what end are we called to discipleship and evangelism? And honestly, I didn't think about this, but really, that's what we're talking about. Even with a preschool, having a Christian preschool as a part of a church is really a blessing that we get to have these families, these 40, 50 families come in, and we have the privilege of teaching their children about Jesus, along with shapes and colors and letters and words and all those other things. We get to teach them about Jesus. And we do this in the context. Every Thursday, they have worship together and just really exciting things. And so, to what end do we understand ourselves in discipleship and evangelism? And when I say that, I'm saying, I don't go out and share my faith with someone for my own personal enjoyment, because a lot of times you get turned down, right? A lot of times it doesn't come out as you wish it would, or the response isn't what you wish it would be. And discipleship is not necessarily any easier. We don't learn how to reorient ourselves towards Jesus without some level of struggle and pain, right? But that we turn and we fix ourselves on Jesus. And because of that, Jesus uses his church, right? The local gathering of believers to reach a community. And so I want to put kind of a main idea up today, a kingdom-focused life. Because Christ purchased us with his death, we need to understand that our calling is greater than our personal desires. Our sacrifice is to live for Christ. Let me just qualify that for a minute. When we come to faith to follow a living Jesus. And when we do so, we realize that our life has to orient towards Jesus. And then that's going to call us out of things and towards something. And that it is our job, it is our response, our appropriate response to Christ, to sacrifice in our life, because Jesus sacrificed to gain us, right? To reconcile us to God. And so it is our sacrifice to live for him. Probably best said in Romans chapter 12, present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect, right? That our response to the gospel, our response to understanding that Jesus gave us life to reconcile us to God, a sinful humanity, to a holy God, our response is to live lives of sacrifice, really sacrificing our life for what Jesus calls us to. Now, we're going to see that in Paul and the team that's with Paul today. We're going to ask ourselves, what is God calling us to do in response? So Acts chapter 20, starting in verse 1, says, after the uproar ceased, Paul sent for the disciples, and after encouraging them, he said, farewell, departed for Macedonia. So the uproar. Last week, if you remember, we were in Ephesus, and a riot breaks out, right? A long-held pastoral goal of mine, right? Start a riot in the city, all right? Hopefully for good reasons, yes. For Jesus should be the qualifier. I'll take any riot, but hopefully for a good reason, right? And really what's going on is that the gospel has taken such root in the city that people are going from worship of Artemis or Diana, and they're turning towards worship of Jesus. And so the metalsmiths and the workers of gold who make idols of Artemis, they're going out of business. And they begin to complain to the other trade guilds. And they're talking like, hey, this guy's preaching against what we do, and we're losing money, literally. The economy has shifted because of the gospel. And so they begin, and they gather together, and they start this riot in the city. And it's right on the other side of this chanting, great is Artemis of the Ephesians, great is Artemis of the Ephesians, great is Artemis of the Ephesians. This riot breaks out in the city. And as it starts to settle down, that's where we pick up our story today. So after the uproar had ceased, verse 2, when he, meaning Paul, had gone through those regions and had given them much encouragement, he came to Greece, and there he spent 3 months. And when a plot was made against him by the Jews, he was about to set sail for Syria. He decided to return through Macedonia. So Paul, as he typically does, on his way to other cities or on his way to wherever he desires to go, and what we're going to find out is he really would like to end up in Jerusalem. But on his way there, what he tends to do is go back through areas where he's already proclaimed the gospel, already discipled leaders and created a church. And he goes back to strengthen the churches, right? Better than starting a new outpost, a new place where there's new believers, better than that is strengthening the church, because the church is the outpost for the gospel. Right? So rather than go lead a couple of people to faith in this city and on over here in the city, he'd rather strengthen the local church, because the local church will reach more people. Right? So that's been his emphasis. Strengthen the local church. Strengthen the believers that gather in Macedonia and Greece and in Ephesus or wherever he goes. And so as he's circling through there, he meets some resistance. He finds there's a plot, but he leaves before that happens, and he goes into another city. Verse 4. Sopater the Berean, the son of Piraeus, accompanied him, and of the Thessalonians, Aristarchus and Secundus and Gaius of Derbe and Timothy, and the Asians, Tychicus and Trophimus. And by the way, I have no idea to pronounce those. I just own it and say it like I think I know what I'm saying. That's the key. If you ever have to read out loud, just own it. And as long as some of the letters are in there, people are going to believe you and they think you're really smart. All right? These went on ahead while we were waiting for us at Troas. But we sailed away from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread, and in 5 days we came to them at Troas, where we stayed for 7 days. Now remember, Luke, our author, the author of Acts, has joined the story, right? And so he's writing now from a first-hand account. And Paul and some people go over here, and some other people go over here. They kind of part ways, take some different routes, and then they end up in the same place. And one of the things that we see here in this list of names that are hard to pronounce, or at minimum, we don't know how to pronounce necessarily, other than I'm pretty sure I got Timothy right. The squad's growing, right? Like the team that is around Paul and Luke is growing. And what Paul's been doing is he's been leading people to faith and discipling people and setting up elders in cities and creating a church, a healthy, sustainable church. But then in each of these areas, he'll run into these people that seem to be called to the ministry he's called to. Now, all of us are called to ministry, right? So there's 100 and something people in the room. I don't know. I'll get a count later, whatever. But it's always just over 100, right? And so if we look at all of us in the room, probably, we're just going to go with 100, probably 98 or 99 of us are probably called to do our ministry here locally, right? Maybe 1, 2, 3 people are called to go do ministry somewhere else, right? The vast majority of all Christians are called to do ministry in their own community, right? That we're here. There's plenty of non-believing people here, right? Just go next door, right, to wherever you live or to your own family. There's plenty of people to reach with the gospel here. There's plenty of ministry to do here. But sometimes God calls someone who can have that unique ministry of either starting churches like church planters or missionaries or whatever, that they go other places. Last week we prayed for Leanna, right? So at some point, I don't know her whole story, but at some point she went to Africa, probably on missions, and met somebody there, saw a need there, got married there, lives there, and now she does ministry there. That's the exception to the rule, right? Here, most of us are called to do ministry right here in our own backyard, right? But Paul has been finding those ones, right? Those unique ones that are called, and he's been taking them with him to train them up in the gospel and show them how to reach a community, or even more importantly, how to share the gospel in a community, then how to go back through and strengthen the churches, creating not just a skill set, but a value system, right? That a healthy local church is more powerful for the gospel than some stellar evangelist, right? That we want to pour into the local gatherings of believers because that's going to be more effective for the kingdom. So he's been taking people with him. Timothy, we know a lot about because Timothy's with him in Ephesus. He's been around him. Then as he writes to the Ephesian church, the letter to the Ephesians, he talks about Timothy. And then when he writes 1st and 2nd Timothy, it's because he sent Timothy back to that church to help lead that church, right? And so we see some of these leaders. Others, we just hear about them here, and the story goes on, right? Verse 7. On the first day of the week, when we were gathered together to break bread, Paul talked with them, intending to depart on the next day. And he prolonged his speech until midnight. There were many lamps in the upper room where we were gathered, and a young man named Eutychus, sitting down at the window, sank into a deep sleep as Paul still talked longer. Hush. And being overcome by sleep, he fell down from the 3rd story and was taken up dead. Yes, there's some obvious preaching jokes here, right? I get it, right? And probably more relevant here is we teach for longer here than other churches. You go around to another 15-minute or 20-minute message. We don't do that. We teach larger passages. We teach for 45 minutes to an hour because we're trying to carve out some space to hear from God, right? But yeah, that's what happens. So he's preaching, and listen, I don't go on for hours. I'm not going to be here at midnight. I'm old. I'm going to be asleep by midnight, right? I'm just saying. There's that. I also have a one-story home, is what he said. If you missed that, that's fair. We could throw you out a window, though, see if it will first floor. We'll see, we can just look, all right? All right. Just for a qualifier before I move on, no one has ever died during my preaching. We did have to call 911 one time at El Dorado, but that was not related to me. I'm just throwing that out there, all right? This also could be a warning about sleeping in church. Maybe, right? Depends on how you look at it. I know, we're all thinking, I wish Casey was here, right? I know. All right, so. It goes both ways, people. I'm just saying that. Verse 10, all right. But Paul went down and bent over him and taking him in his arms said, "Do not be alarmed, for his life is in him." And when Paul had gone up and had broken bread and eaten, he conversed with them a long while until daybreak, and so departed. Paul clearly doesn't learn his lesson, right? He's just going to preach until morning. And they took the youth away, verse 12, alive and were not a little comforted, right? So Paul was not done. He pauses, heals the guy, and continues. I'm just saying, just throwing it out there. Let it apply how it applies. Verse 13, but going ahead to the ship, we set sail for Assos, intending to take Paul aboard there, for so he had arranged, intending himself to go by land. And we met us at Assos, we took him on board and went to Mytilene. And sailing from there, we came the following day opposite Chios, and the next day we touched down at Samos, and the day after that we went to Miletus, for Paul had decided to sail past Ephesus so that he might not have to spend time in Asia, for he was hastening to be at Jerusalem, if possible, on the day of Pentecost. Now, if you remember from the opening chapters of Acts, Pentecost is a Jewish festival or a Jewish holiday 50 days after Passover, right? Penti, 50, right? 50 days later. And so we just saw the day of unleavened bread. That was Passover. We're just past that. Paul's got an idea to get to Jerusalem. That's Paul's plan. That's not God's plan, if you've read the rest of Acts, right? And he's going around. And so as he goes through these cities, he's on his kind of sailing trip, this boat trip, right? He goes around Ephesus. It's not because he doesn't care about Ephesus. He just spent 3 years pastoring a church in Ephesus. And if he were to stop by there, it's no short stop, right? It's lengthy, right? And so he wants to try and get somewhere by a certain date. Again, spoiler alert, he's not going to make it, but, right? That's his goal. So he goes around Ephesus, not because he doesn't care about them. He's actually going to send for some of the leaders to meet with him, right? Paul has a unique relationship with the church in Ephesus. He pastored that church longer and stayed in that city longer than he stays anywhere else, right? He was just in a city above, I think it was Macedonia, for like 3 months or whatever it says, right? That's normal. Ephesus was 3 years. And so he has a deep love for them. Again, we read about them in Acts. They get a letter, the letter to the Ephesians, right? 1st and 2nd Timothy, Revelation. Actually, one of the 7 churches is Ephesus. So we learn a lot about the church in Ephesus. And Paul's heart for Ephesus is huge. But he knows that a pause there is not a short one, right? And so he keeps moving, and he is going to send for them. So verse 17, now from Miletus he sent to Ephesus and called the elders of the church to come to him. So he calls the Ephesian elders to come and join him. Now I would imagine, since he was just there recently, right? He's been gone for a few months. Let's call it a year. And so these are probably men that he discipled, maybe some that he had shared the gospel with. Maybe they heard the gospel from him the first time. But for sure, these are men he invested in and raised up. I know our elders, we are close, right? We love one another. We share the highs and lows of life together. And I have a unique relationship to them, right? Investing in, meeting with, study. We've studied scripture together. I don't know how many times, Chris and I, right? There's a unique relationship there. And if I were to move on, and I've had the privilege of planting 2 churches and restarting 2 churches. So I've pastored as a lead pastor in multiple contexts, and I've handed off churches before. Most of you guys know Pastor Vanny and Pastor Mike, and we've handed off churches to them, and I have a unique relationship, but especially to the elders, right? That we're uniquely connected because we've been in the trenches of ministry together. We've been in that relationship together, and that's where Paul is. As he lands in Miletus, he sends for the elders because he still cares about this church. But to stop there is to, it'd be rude to say hi, but we can't hang out. I got to go over here. Oh, hi, but we can't hang out, and really just got to do this. And so he calls for them to join him. Verse 18, it says, when they came to him, he said to them, you yourselves know how I lived among you the whole time from the first day that I set foot in Asia, serving the Lord with all humility, with tears, and with trials that happened to me through the plots of the Jews. How I did not shrink from declaring to you anything that was profitable, and teaching you in public and from house to house, testifying both to Jews and Greeks of repentance towards God and of our faith in the Lord Jesus Christ. This is probably as close to we get about Paul as a sermon to believers, right? As he sits with his elders, he begins to speak to them. He gives this kind of speech to them. And a lot of times we see him when he's speaking, like when we saw at Mars Hill or the Areopagus in Athens, he's speaking to non-believers, and we see a lot of his gospel presentation in places. But when he speaks to believers, especially leaders, he speaks differently. And he's really got 3 things he's highlighting. He says, I did not shrink from declaring anything that was profitable, right? His discipleship of them, probably some or most of these men themselves, right? I didn't hold anything back as I was pouring into you guys, right? He says, teaching you in public and from house to house. This would be his teaching and preaching ministry, right? As he, in public, maybe more like this, and from house to house, like we have community groups, things like that. Like, here's how I did this. I didn't hold anything back. I taught you in public and from house to house. And then he says, testifying of repentance in our Lord Jesus Christ, his more evangelistic side, right? So we see how he discipled. We see how he preached and how he taught, and we see how he evangelized. And as he's sitting with these elders, remember, his emphasis is healthy church. A healthy local church will reach the community. If we can pour into them, they can reach the community. They will be more effective. And again, we're talking about Paul, the apostle, like the most prominent first century church leader beyond Jesus, right? It's either him or Peter, right? He's made a huge impact in the first century landscape of Christianity. He writes more New Testament letters than anybody else. This guy's up there as far as like success rate in ministry, if you will. I'd hate to say it that way. But rather than him going from town to town to share the gospel, the more effective thing is pour into the church, right? Develop the local church. He knew that, and he was highly effective, right? He shared the gospel. People came to faith. He started churches. He was very effective in helping the gospel spread. Now, I don't mean it's about him. Clearly, it's the Spirit of God using him. But his emphasis is always not about what God can do through him, but what God can do through the local church. And so he highlights that, remember, my discipleship, evangelism, my preaching and teaching ministry, remember this. and how I held nothing back. Verse 22. He says, and now, behold, I'm going to Jerusalem, constrained by the Spirit, not knowing what will happen to me there, except that the Holy Spirit testifies to me in every city that imprisonment and afflictions await me. He doesn't pitch it like vacation, right? Like, hey, can't wait to go visit this, right? He's like, listen, constrained by the Spirit, here's my plan. I don't really know what awaits me except for imprisonment and beating, right? I'm going to be arrested, I'm going to be beaten, I'm going to be afflicted, I'm going to be in chains. That's what's in front of me. That's all God's told me, but he said, go. I'm compelled to go. See, Paul understood that his life or his wants or his joy or his pastime or his financial success or you feel it his whatever was secondary to his call in the gospel. Right? That he was to lay his life down and that he was to follow where the Spirit leads. Right? Now, this is not just for the person, the 1% or 2% that are called to go somewhere. This is the call of every Christian. You see, the gospel comes through sacrifice. The gospel comes through God giving his only Son to cover our sin. The gospel comes through Jesus, the second person of the Trinity, entering into human flesh, which is a sacrifice already. Jesus is God on the throne. He's creator. And then he puts on flesh to come to us. That's already a sacrifice. He already humbles himself into the form of a human being. And then to live in an area stricken with poverty and to be rejected by his friends and his people. To then go on and lay down his life as a sacrifice for sin. Because when God created us and taught us how to live even before sin, we chose to go our own way. And so that sin requires punishment. And so Jesus came to be our punishment. Jesus came to take our place. So the entire, all of Jesus is sacrifice. He humbled himself to become flesh. He lived a sinless life. Never once did Jesus say, this would be easier, but God said this, I'm still going to do this. You know what we do, right? But he lived a life of sacrifice, always living for God. And then, because of our sin, he went and gave his perfect sinless life to die in our place when we were still enemies of God. That he would be a sacrifice, and on a cross, the wrath of God is poured out on Jesus so that the wrath of God doesn't have to be poured out on us. That if we can place ourselves in Christ, if we can begin to live for Jesus, then he takes the wrath of God for our sin, not us. His sacrifice. So the response to the gospel is to then live for Jesus. Right? If he sacrificed to gain relationship with us to the Father, a holy God, in relationship with sinful humanity, bridged by the sacrifice of Christ himself that God gave for us, then if that's how we are won by the gospel, then our only response is to respond by faith and lay down our lives for Jesus. You with me? Right? Not just say, hey, thanks for the forgiveness, I'm going to go live any way I want to. Which is what we do. Right? But to learn that the gospel equals sacrifice. Here's how Jesus said it about himself in Matthew. It says, from that time, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed, and on the third day be raised. So Jesus, knowing what was ahead of him, turned, fixed his eyes on Jerusalem, went there knowing he's going to be betrayed, he's going to be falsely accused, falsely condemned, falsely tried, and then falsely punished by being hung on a cross. But that in that he was obeying God in that, and that in that he would reconcile us to God if we're in Christ. And so Jesus fixed his eyes on what was ahead, not on what he wanted. Right? We see a little moment of the humanity of Jesus in the garden saying, is there any other way, God? But not my will, but your will be done. right? That Jesus had this like, hey, this is going to be hard. This is painful. Is there another way? But not my will, God, but your will be done. Right? As not just being our perfect Savior, but teaching us of what it looks like to follow Jesus, to be a follower of God, right? Let's reread verse 22 again. So Paul says, and now, behold, I am going to Jerusalem, constrained by the Spirit, not knowing what will happen to me there, except that the Holy Spirit testifies to me in every city that imprisonment and afflictions await me. So if Jesus did it, and Paul did it, it's almost like word for word, that's probably what we're called to do, right? To lay down our lives for the sake of the gospel, to live for God. If that means pain is ahead, it means pain is ahead. If that means just denying what we want to do and rather do what God has called us to do, then that's what it means. Here's a note for you. The mission is greater. Paul, like Jesus, understood that the mission of the gospel was more important than his personal life. This is often lost on modern disciples today. This is lost on Christianity in America. Right? We're sold a gospel that says Jesus died to forgive your sins so that you can go to heaven. It's all about us. We miss that we're called to live for the living Jesus and die to ourselves. But even in the way the gospel is presented today, forgiveness, heaven, it's like we're marketing it to us. Teaching us that it's all about us when it's not about us. It's about the kingdom. That we are to live for our King. Verse 24, but I do not account my life of any value, nor as precious to myself, if only I may finish my course in the ministry that I received from the Lord Jesus, to testify to the gospel of the grace of God. Right? Do you hear Paul's loss of personal whatever? Maybe he had goals at one point. Maybe he had a life he wanted to live. Maybe he had a thing he wanted to do. But all that got laid down for the gospel. And Paul in other books says, listen, it sounds like sacrifice, but it's been best. Like, I put aside this, I followed God, and it was best that I did. We see it as sacrifice, like we need to lay this down, or we really want to do this, but God says, no, we want to do this, or we want to pursue this job, or this sport, or this thing, but I want to do this, but God says, no, go here. And when we do it, when we start, it sounds like such a sacrifice, but when we actually do it, we realize it was the best thing all along anyways. Isn't this the call of every single believer? Here's Luke 9, as Jesus is speaking. He said to all, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. Whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will save it. What does it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses or forfeits himself? And isn't it like that when we gain something? We get to promotion, and then we realize, this job's just a headache anyways, right? Or we win the game, and we're like, okay, now we got to go on to the next game. Like, it's never satisfying. So what does it profit us to chase this life and lose Jesus? Rather than chase Jesus and lose nothing and gain everything. Because that's the call of every believer. Jesus is Jesus, yes, Jesus is unique, right? But we always treat Paul as if he's a superhero. Paul's just another Christian who does what he's called to do. So does Timothy, so does Sopater, and the rest of that, Gaius, and the rest of that list we read. They've laid everything down to follow Jesus. This isn't one-off stuff. This is what we're all called to do. Verse 25. Paul says, and now behold, I know that none of you among whom I have gone about proclaiming the kingdom will see my face again. Therefore, I testify to you this day that I am innocent of the blood of all, for I did not shrink from declaring to you the whole counsel of God. This is like the opposite of marketing the gospel to someone, right? Well, let me see if I can sell it to you, forgiveness in heaven. Let's see if I can talk you into it by the sound of how good it sounds. This is Paul like, I've held nothing back, right? I had not shrink from declaring to you the whole counsel of God. Well, there's nothing to shrink from if it's all just blessing and great and happy and joyful. But he's like, hey, there's an actual call in his life. Like there's an actual sacrifice in living for Jesus. But I don't shrink back from telling you that. I preached the whole counsel of God. Paul held nothing back when he taught. Verse 28. Pay careful attention to yourselves and to all the flock in which the Holy Spirit has made you overseers. Again, remember, he's talking to the overseers, the elders of the church. He says, to care for the church of God, which he obtained with his own blood. This is directed at the elders of the church. We pay careful attention to yourselves and to all the flock in which the Holy Spirit has made you overseers to care for the church, which he obtained with his own blood. You hear that? The weight of that? Right? That we as elders are called to care for the church that Jesus obtained by his blood. He's not like, I won them in a poker game. I gave my life for them. Right? I died literally to attain them. Now, I'm going to entrust you with their care. You hear the weight of that? That's why it says not many should strive to be elders, because they're held to a higher accountability. It's because we're called to shepherd the people that Jesus gave his life to obtain. What a huge call. Even our deacons and worship and all of that. Like, don't be quick to jump into this. Like, you're caring for the people Jesus died for. Verse 29. I know that after my departure, fierce wolves will come in among you, not sparing the flock. And from among your own selves will arise men speaking twisted things. Listen to this. To draw away the disciples after them. What's the warning that the elders are being so seriously charged to protect? Right? Listen, I bought these people. There's a weight to what Paul is saying, is that Jesus gave his blood for these people. He literally died to obtain them for the church, to make them disciples. And he's charging the elders with their care. And then look at what he says. That others will come in and draw away disciples. And there's definitely words in here that are speaking to false doctrines and teaching wrong things. But what today draws away disciples? And for real, distraction is what draws away disciples today. Right? There is so much going on that you have to prioritize Jesus over and above these things in order not to be pulled out of the church. Right? Distraction. And does that come from a false teaching? It does. Does that come from twisted things? Sure, it does. But it comes from not being called to, commit to lay down our lives for Jesus and all that means. And distraction pulls disciples out more often than not. So here's a note for you. Disciples perpetuate the mission. Paul knew how to keep the gospel mission going. The elders would need to keep the disciples clearly focused on the mission, then the world would know Jesus. See, if we are kept clearly focused on the mission, then the distractions get set aside. Right? When you're training for something, if you're in the gym or you're running, you're doing whatever, you're training hard for something, diet stuff comes along. It's like it's easier to focus on, like, I have this, I'm focused on this, right? And so I don't want to eat Doritos or McDonald's. I want to eat something that'll fuel my body as I train for this. Well, the same thing, as we fix our eyes, as we lean into the mission that Jesus has called every one of us to, the things that need to be set aside, the distractions that need to be put away, the things that need to be jettisoned from our life, they become easier to do because we're not thinking about what I have to give up, we're just thinking about what I'm pursuing. That as we strive towards Jesus, the things that need to fall away make more sense to fall away. Verse 31, therefore, be alert, remembering that for 3 years I did not cease night or day to admonish everyone with tears. He's reminding them of the 3 years he spent in Ephesus. And it's not like, hey, how I kind of mentioned it's a good idea to do this. He's like, that I admonished everyone with tears. Like he put his whole into this. Verse 32, and now I commend you to God, I commend you to God and to the word of his grace, which is able to build you up and to give you the inheritance among all those who are sanctified. Right now, I commend you to God. He's still speaking to the elders on the shore of Miletus who are going back to Ephesus to care for the church in Ephesus, because his heart is to see the local church in Ephesus be healthy and reach Ephesus. Remember, Ephesus is a gigantic area. It's like Long Beach. It's this hub of culture and economy and trade. It's this huge, impactful area. And he knows that better than him being there is a healthy church there. And how you have a healthy church is you make sure healthy elders are leading people in a healthy way, that they have a healthy church, that the gospel continues to go out to the community. I commend you to God and to the word of his grace, which is able to build you up and give you an inheritance among all those who are sanctified. Verse 33, I coveted no one's silver or gold or apparel. You yourselves know that these hands minister to my necessities and to those who are with me. And all things I have shown you, that by working hard in this way, we must help the weak. And remember the words of the Lord Jesus, how he himself said, it is more blessed to give than to receive. Paul's emphasis here is about denial, about living for others. Remember, Paul went in and made tents. He worked alongside Priscilla and Aquila, and they tanned skins and did all these things and created these artisan tents that he sold and made his own living. He's like, listen, I made my own living, my own hands, and I cared for other people. You understand, he did this how many hours a day and then did ministry afterwards. This wasn't about him setting up a nice little cushy life in Ephesus. This was about the call of God. This was about him laying down what he wants and living for Jesus wholly and completely. Verse 36, and when he had said these things, he knelt down and prayed with them all. And there was much weeping on the part of all, and they embraced and they kissed him, being sorrowful most of all because of the word that he had spoken, that they would not see his face again. And they accompanied him to the ship. Paul's final words here to the leaders whom he loved so dearly was a reminder of the selfless life that we are all called to in Christ. I even remember just kind of in this moment as he says, you'll never see me again, right? Like, here's my sacrifice. I love all these people, and I love these elders, but you're not going to see me again because I'm going over here because God has called me to go over here, and over here waits imprisonment and punishment and all of this. Like I said, I've started 2 churches, and I've restarted 2 churches. And there comes a time in each of those churches where you're handing off, right? And I can remember when we were leaving Huntington Beach to move to the high desert. I remember the first time they asked me about it, and I said, you guys have the wrong kind of sand, right? High desert beach. Like, no, it's not the same thing, right? Finally, they got me to visit, and I walked in the church, and I'm like, oh, I'm moving here. I can just feel it. I went home. My wife's like, we're moving, aren't we? I'm like, yeah, I think so, right? And I remember handing that church off, and it was celebratory. We were praying over Pastor Vinny. A lot of you know Pastor Vinny, and we were praying over him and Sherry and his kids and the church and the elders. And it was joyful, but it was also like, hey, listen, I'm disconnecting from this. Like, we always talk about, like, kind of on staff and kind of in leadership here, like, my world is as big as this church. Now, I know thousands and thousands of people from pastoring all over different places, right? But when I move, we move, right? And the guys I text about football are in this room, or about Jeeps or whatever, because there's plenty of Jeeps in this room, right? So it's internal. It's not them. There's people that like the same teams and like to go wheeling and do all that, but my world's this big because that's where we're called to be. And Paul knows, like, listen, you're to go do your thing. I'm to go do this. Even in his leaving, in his exit, you can see the sacrifice. You won't see me again. I'm calling you to sacrifice, and I'm sacrificing. I'm going where Jesus is calling me to go. I am constrained by the Spirit. It's not like I can't wait to get there. It's like I'm being forced by the Spirit of God to go there. And in each city, there's abuse and imprisonment along the way. Not just like when I get there. He says in every city along the way. That's what I know is ahead of me. But he doesn't blink. In fact, he went all the way around Ephesus so that he could get to where he's going faster. Because to go through Ephesus would have taken time. He would have had to have dinner with this family and hang out over here and probably preach on Sunday and do these other things. But he's like, nope, I got a call. I've got somewhere God has called me to be. And I'd much rather go have dinner with the friends or preach in the church. I pastored for 3 years. I'd much rather do that. But I'm on my way to imprisonment and affliction because I'm constrained by the Spirit to go. Paul lives a life of sacrifice, and we try and write him off as this one-off guy who does things we're not called to do. But so far, we got Jesus who did it for us, and we have every leader since then imitating what it looks like to follow Jesus. Somehow we've divorced ourselves from that idea that we're called to lay down everything in our lives to follow Jesus, even if we're called to lay it down and live here. And do ministry here, not have to go there. So what can we learn from Paul's final words to this Ephesian elders? I'm going to give you 3 things. Here's the first one. What did Paul teach that he learned from Jesus? But I do not account my life of any value or as precious to myself, if only I may finish my course and the ministry that I received from the Lord Jesus to testify to the gospel of the grace of God. This is what Paul taught others that he learned from the model of Jesus and from the teachings of Jesus. That all that matters is that we do the gospel work that we're called to do. Not we, pastors and elders, we, followers of Jesus. That all that matters is that we do the gospel work that God has called us to do, that Jesus has called us to. Our lives are of no value. Our lives find their value in Christ alone. Next slide. What did Jesus teach about this? In John 6, for I've come down from heaven, not to do my own will, but the will of him who sent me. Jesus says, I didn't even come to do my own will. I came to do the will of the Father who sent me. We see that lived out in Jesus. We see that lived out in Paul. We see that lived out in Peter as we followed Peter through the first half of Acts. Why do we then think that's not the same calling for us? To not do our will, but to do the will of God who is sending us, even if it's sending us next door. Next one. What are we called to do in response? And we read this verse earlier. If anyone would come after me, this is Jesus speaking, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. Whoever would save his life will lose it. Whoever loses his life for my sake will save it. You couldn't have a more universal statement from Jesus that applies to us. If anyone, just anyone, if anyone wants to follow me, here's what he needs to do. He needs to lay down his life, take up his cross daily, like crucify yourself and your desires and your wishes daily and follow Jesus. You got to set aside your career goals. You got to set aside your hobbies and sports, and maybe some of that gets to come along for the ride, and maybe it doesn't. But you got to be willing to mortify, to kill, to die to those things, to follow Jesus. Right? You don't get to pick and choose like, I follow Jesus here, but I got this little thing here. Right? And we all do it. Lay down your life. Crucify it. Follow Jesus. He says, because what does it matter if you win all this and then it dies with you? And you lose everything then. But rather, you lose a little bit now and gain everything in Christ. That's the call for all of us. It's not for some super special Christians like Paul who have some super cool title and go do. It's for all of us. From Jesus, it's what Jesus did. It's what Paul did. It's what the church, it's what the early church did. It's what we're called to. So takeaway, what's an application you'll make that you can apply to your life this week? Consider some of these categories. Myself, for me, I want to live a more sacrificial life, denying myself of things in order to discipline myself to be more on the mission Jesus has for me. If you're mature in your faith, your job is to pour into the younger believers and prepare them for a life of denial and mission for Christ. If you're a new believer, your job is to be discipled, taught how to live for Jesus. Conversion and baptism is not it, it's simply a start. It's not a destination, it's a beginning to start living for Jesus. If you're here and you're not a follower of Jesus, the gospel is a reorienting of everything towards following a living Jesus. It's not a prayer you pray or a promise of future saving, but it's a turn towards Jesus in everything that you do. Parents, are you teaching your kids that it is not about life in this world, but rather it's about sacrificially living for Jesus every day, day after day, in order to reach the lost? Now, don't leave. This is not like, oh, I get to get out early. This is, what is your takeaway that you will share with someone? I know it's been like mass exodus after this. Wait. Turn to somebody. Share. What is your takeaway this week? And if you have somebody sitting around you who's alone, make sure you turn and include them.